What terrifying confession has someone told you while drunk? Story 1. At a family gathering, my grandma got tipsy and started to tell stories from her childhood. While she does this every time, no matter tipsy or sober, guess it's just a normal grandma thing, this time it took a dark turn. She told us a story that is the reason she hates to go to the dentist and particularly hates the drilling part. She told us a story about when she was 6 years old. During World War II, my family lived in Hamburg, Germany, right next to the harbor. During a particular week in 1943, the city was continuously bombed and over 35,000 people died and more than 100,000 were injured. The houses that were hit, most of them burned down, creating a huge fire, with such force that it sucked not only oxygen in, creating strong winds, but people. The fire created such heat that people running out of their burning houses got stuck in the molten asphalt in the streets and burned to death. As it was all happening around her, that particular smell was present for over a week in her part of the city. Drilling your tooth creates that same smell. My grandma had to stop the dentist as she recognized it immediately. The story shook us to the core as it came out of the blue, and it still sends chills down my spine. We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description. Story 2. My mother always hated driving over a particular bridge, one that had a metal mesh as the roadbed. The sound the tires make is very particular. We used to tease her about it for years. One day, she had enough and told us why. When she was a wave in World War II, she went out to party with some sailors. One of them had a car with running boards, and one more sailor wanted to come along, one the other guys didn't like. They told him to ride on the running board and hang on. When they went over a bridge with a similar roadbed, they hit the gas, and the extra sailor fell off and was run over. She was still carrying the guilt 40 years later. Story 3. A friend of mine died from a drug overdose. After the funeral, a mutual friend of ours and I were getting drunk when he broke down crying. He asked me if I remember the time when he and our dead friend told me about an accident that they'd witnessed where they saw a truck driver die. I told him I did. He then told me the most screwed up thing. He said that our friend ran up to the dying man and stole his wedding ring, and that the man couldn't do anything but look up, terrified at our friend as he was being robbed. I knew they were bad into drugs, but I never thought they could do anything like that. I grew up with them. They were like my brothers. I don't really trust anyone anymore completely. Story 4. No drugs or alcohol involved, but I have somewhat of a similar story. A few years ago, my mom witnessed an accident. A lady was texting, blew through a red light, and T-boned a truck with an elderly man driving. My mom jumped out of her car and held on to him while waiting for an ambulance. The girl who hit him, early 20s, was freaking out and called her mom. The mom showed up first and kept telling my mom, "Just tell the cops he ran the red light, no one will know." And he died. My mom heard his last words, sounds, really, that she repeated for weeks. My mom cried for days. She met the family, and it was the man and his wife's anniversary or something like that. We obviously told the cops the truth, but we don't know of any follow-up. His obituary is framed on our wall. I just hate to think that the last thing he heard was just tell the cops that it was his fault. Story 5. One of my best friends since middle school opened up to me the day we had our last day of high school. We had been partying all day, got off at 10 a.m., but most people left around 3 to go and get ready for the seniors' dinner and after party and whatnot. My friend stayed behind with our class president. I told him I'd pick him up for dinner and left. When I got back, both were falling down drunk and in tears. A few years earlier, our class president had lost his father. I take my buddy back to his house so he can get changed for the dinner, and on the way, he tells me what happened. They had kept drinking when everyone left and eventually got to the topic of their dads. I had never met my friend's dad. He died, and that was all I knew. I never knew how he died. It turns out my buddy's dad was a lawyer or something in the country he's from and was being extorted by a gang. When money started to run out, my buddy's dad sent the family to another country and told him he'd meet them there, that he had some things to finish up. A few weeks after moving, they learned that he had been murdered by the gang, and it completely screwed up my friend. We always used to drink heavily and whatever since we were in high school. I mean, for me, it was just drinking. For my buddy, it was numbing the pain. It was a shocker when he told me this, and it really made me understand him a lot more, like why he acted the way he did. Story 6. It was me who did the confessing. When I was 18, I was assaulted on a bridge in the middle of the night when I was all alone. My mom works in hearing, and she always told me to bite someone if I got in trouble. So I did. I bit into his neck until my teeth met. He fell down, and then I ran all the way home. A few weeks later, I read in the news that a serial assaulter had gone to the hospital with neck wounds and later died. They'd drawn it down to him attacking someone and them attacking in self-defense. I never told anyone until I got really drunk with my boyfriend last year and spilled it. He couldn't believe I'd kept that secret. Story 7. I had someone tell me that he touched his daughter when she was an infant because he was angry and thought that his girlfriend had cheated on him and that she wasn't his biological daughter. He went on to say DNA testing was done and it was determined that she was his daughter, and he felt very guilty about the whole thing. His daughter was 7 or 8 at the time he told me this. I literally spent a night tossing and turning thinking about it and finally decided that I had to report him. Story 8. My mother's first husband, the sperm donor. I was 16. She had just walked out that same day and he got extremely drunk and told me that I was never supposed to have been born and that I should have died with my brother. I asked him what he meant by my brother since I had no siblings, and he confessed to beating the crap out of my mother when she was pregnant and she ended up in the hospital. I was born, but my twin brother died in the womb. At the time, my mother's English, she's Polish, wasn't good, so he claimed to doctors that she just fell down the stairs and threatened to have her deported and used me as blackmail if she ever told anyone. I followed her soon after once she had contacted me that she'd found a place to stay. I asked her if she had anything to say regarding my birth, and she told me the same story. I guess that explains why I felt like I was missing a part of myself all my life. Story 9. When I was 14, my mom took me and my sisters and a couple of our friends to the beach. My sister, 15, and I got our own room with our 2 friends and wound up meeting some boys and getting drunk. My sister's friend, 15F, was really drunk and got super upset, and confessed that her stepfather had been touching her and assaulting her for years. Really horrible stuff. It sobered everyone up fast. We rallied around her, told her we were there for her, and yada yada. But when we got home from the beach trip a few days later, I knew I needed to tell my mom. After I told my mom, she got the state police involved. There was a trial, and the man wound up sentenced to 8 years in prison. It turned out he was doing it to the younger sister as well. Story 10. My mother once told me a story while drunk. She had a pregnancy before me, but her boyfriend wasn't ready for a kid, so he kicked her in the stomach until she was no longer pregnant. So for revenge, she had her friend, who was an escort, seduce him, take him to a hotel room, and tied him up. My mom then described how she took a baseball bat and broke every bone she could of his. Described how she had to throw water on him to keep him awake. She was never tried for it, so I'm assuming he lived. I had heard the kicked in the stomach till miscarriage part before. The bat thing was a new detail, and she hasn't mentioned it since. Story 11. When he was 11, my dad was abducted and assaulted by 3 men. He was so terrified that he never told his parents. After my grandpa passed away, my dad finally told my grandma what happened. She told him that they already knew. One of my dad's siblings knew and had told grandpa. She just said that he had taken care of it. A few years later, a developer bought my grandparents' farm and turned it into a development. During the excavation, they found 3 male skeletons buried in a single grave. I guess grandpa really did take care of it. Rangers really do lead the way. Story 12. My mom was in another state for business. A company flew her out to Texas to discuss a change in software and offered their company, and so it was just my dad taking care of me. I was about 10 and he came to tuck me in one night, but he was hammered. He opened the door to my bedroom, told me I was a mistake that saved them from getting divorced, and good night. Worst part is, he didn't close the door completely when he left. Story 13. I had a boyfriend who never talked about his past ever. He talked so fondly of his old state, but just about the state, never the people. If you tried to prod any further, he would just say, oh, well, it doesn't matter anymore. We were young. I was about 19 and he was probably 23 or so. He drank a crap ton all the time, and whatever, we were young, so I thought that was just normal and all in good fun. One night, while plastered, he started talking about how much he loved going into the woods, and how he and his friends enjoyed playing on the rivers and streams in his old state. Then he got very sad and started to babble a bit incoherently. I heard him say something along the lines of his friend came to his house on drugs, and they were all also on drugs. Then more incoherent babbling, then something about his friend getting shot in the face, and then more incoherent babbling, then something about that is why he can never go home again. He was so desperately sad and missed his home very much. You could tell every time the topic came up. So yeah, I'm pretty sure he accidentally, or on purpose, killed a guy and was on the run. I have my money on accident because he seemed so distraught, but you never know. Also, you barely know anyone or anything at 19 years old. I often wonder if he ever had to face those demons. Story 14. Shared an off-campus apartment with a very cool older guy in college. He was a nurse. Got up super early every morning to do his shifts. Every night, you could find him at his regular Irish pub. They let me drink there without ID because they knew I was with him. Basically, a super high-functioning alcoholic. One day, I came home after finishing my exams. He brings out a bottle of Jameson to celebrate. It was about 2/3 full. After a few shots, he starts telling me about his time in Vietnam. I'd known him for 2 years and he never brought it up, and I had never asked. I knew he had been a vet, but assumed that he was a nurse. Nope. Special Forces. His demeanor totally changed after a few drinks. He started telling me about having to go out on covert operations to carry out assassinations of civilians. He said he dreams of the faces of all the people he killed. We ended up polishing off the entire bottle. He got up the next morning at 5 a.m. and went off to work. I spent the entire day moaning in bed and praying to the porcelain god. We never spoke about it again. Story 15. I got drunk with my uncle and we started talking about relationships, and as a game I asked, "What's the biggest mistake you ever made in a relationship?" We went back and forth saying all the dumb and screwed up things we've done to the women in our lives, and it's escalating and we're becoming more and more honest. Until eventually he shouts excitedly, "I beat her!" It got dead silent. We drank quietly and then went to bed. It's never really been the same since. Story 16. My friend's husband told me he was hiding liquor from his wife, my friend, which was weird because they both drink and it's really not a big deal. I told my friend what he said and she confronted him and all of his lies started pouring out. Cheating on her with multiple women, lying about his income, taking credit cards out in her name, racking up tens of thousands of dollars of debt, stealing from their kids' college funds. Yeah, they're divorced now. That weird little lie he told me while drunk is what started it all. Story 17. When I moved to the current city I live in, I found a roommate on Craigslist. It was 2011, so not as weird as it would be today, and he was really cool. He lived in a double master house, so I ended up having a lot of privacy. He was a young real estate agent, and we ended up hanging out in each other's social circles. Well, we'll call him M, ended up catching feelings for this girl that became pretty close to me. When the feelings weren't reciprocated, he started getting weird and almost resentful towards me, but I digress. Over time, we found out that M had a drinking problem. I would get home from work around 1 a.m., and it wasn't uncommon that he would be passed out on the couch after finishing off one of those cheap liter bottles of wine. One night, I get home a little early, and I notice him sitting with his back against the couch in the total dark. I ask him if he's okay. I can immediately tell he's emotionally distressed. With the drunk wine next to him, he begins telling me that when he first moved to the city, he caught his girlfriend in bed with another guy and shot and killed him. His girlfriend fled the state, and because it was in a shifty part of town, police never paid it much attention. So basically, he got away with it, and he thinks about it all the time. I gracefully made my exit upstairs, freaking the frick out. When I saw him the next morning, he asked me what time I got home from work because he didn't hear me coming in, meaning he has no recollection of telling me he murdered someone. I had my dad help me move out the next week, and I never mentioned it to him. Story 18. I overheard a murder confession. I was at a resort in New England with my family. I went onto the balcony to smoke. I could hear people talking somewhere above and to my right. They were very drunk. The man said he was going crazy with guilt. He shot someone over a drug deal and he drives by the memorial all the time. I couldn't tell which unit the people were in. The man had no discernible accent. He never mentioned a city name or anything, no details at all. I really wish I could have helped solve a murder. Story 19. I have two. I had a housemate in college who several years prior had accidentally shot and killed a friend of his in a hunting accident. He went to trial and was acquitted of all charges. Years later, he didn't tell me, but he told a woman I was intimate with that it wasn't an accident. Years ago, when I worked at Las Vegas Hilton in the main kitchen, I had a very high-strung boss named Hussein. He was from Turkey. We jokingly referred to him as insane because of his personality. Once, after our shift was over, he grabbed a case of beer from the supply walk-in refrigerator and invited a few of us to help ourselves. He had probably 4 or 5 himself. He then proceeded to tell us that when he lived in Turkey, he had kicked some guy's butt and came to the US to get away. My coworkers and I didn't really give it much thought. About a month later, we came to find out that while on vacation in Mexico, Hussein had been walking back to his hotel room after drinking at a bar. He had ducked down an alley to take a leak and was caught by a policeman. He was charged and convicted of public urination. At least at the time, the US didn't have reciprocity with Turkey, but Mexico did. Well, it turns out that what Hussein had described as kicking someone's butt turned out to be murder. He was taken back to Turkey, where we assume that he spent the rest of his life in a Turkish prison. The movie The Midnight Express portrays what life is like there. Story 20. Not really a confession, but more of something no one ever told me. One time, I was watching a movie with my mom and she had had a few drinks. She wasn't wasted, but she was more talkative. Something in the movie made her talk about her life leading up to now. Apparently, a year or two before I was born, she was pregnant and suffered a miscarriage because the pharmacist gave her the wrong medication and they told her she wouldn't be able to have children again. This was the first time in 17 years I had ever heard anything about this, so it came as a complete shock to me. Story 21. I'm an officer. I arrived at a stabbing call as a backup unit and ended up transporting the suspect back to cells. He was extremely drunk/high. He started talking semi-coherently in the back seat of my PC, and I was mostly ignoring him. At one point, he said something like, "And this isn't even the first time I've done this. She was so young." And then he started bawling. I flipped on my recorder surreptitiously to see if he would say any more, but he didn't. He just cried and cried. Intox confessions are generally useless anyway, and once he sobered up and spoke to his lawyer, he denied having any knowledge. I talked to our major crimes guys, but don't think they did anything with it. I still wonder, though. It wasn't bravado, that's for sure. Story 22. Grew up in the South, so lots of people would say racist crap while drunk. Would usually start with an edgy joke early in the night, and if I didn't react, then they felt safe to complain about black people later. My favorite version of this happening was one time where this guy totally read the room wrong and he got his butt beat. I was at a Halloween party/punk show, and there were a lot of skinheads there. Now, a lot of people are unaware that there are non-racist skinheads called traditional skinheads. Traditional skinheads hate Nazi skinheads for making people think all skinheads are racist. So, one guy at this party, who was clearly unaware of this distinction, decided to call a black fellow at this party a N-word, F-slur, and then square up for a fight. Immediately, 4 or 5 skins knocked this guy into a corner and beat the hell out of him. Funniest part though was after the fight was over, this guy gets in his car to leave, but he had left his shirt behind. So someone from the party brings it out to him. This guy rolls his window down to accept the shirt, and the partygoer gives him one last punch in the face as a going away present. Story 24. Not drunk, but high on acid, and my friend got super talkative and honest. He went to the local red light district to do a bit of window shopping. On this particular occasion, he decided that he wanted to purchase a young lady, so he picked one out and brought her back to a hotel room. They got down to business, at which point my friend found a dong under her skirt that she hadn't told him about. He was surprised, but decided that since he'd paid for it, he was going to keep going. During the course of it, the young lady/gentleman put their finger up my friend's butthole, losing a very sharp fingernail in the process and causing an anal fissure. He had to go to the hospital, and they gave him one of those soft rings to sit on. He'd been telling everyone that it was a sports injury. Story 27. My best friend disappeared for a while, presumably left town. We were both in our mid-20s. He came back after a month or so, and he'd take me out every night drinking and partying. I wondered how he was able to blow so much money on drugs and alcohol, but he wouldn't tell me. I saw him pay our tab one night, and he must have had 12 or 15 grand on him. After coming back to town, he basically stayed inebriated at all times and wanted to hang out with me whenever he could. He'd come over to my place after closing the bars down, and we'd often keep partying until morning. He would usually end up breaking down and crying to me about how he can't live with himself over what he did, but would never give any details. Night after night, this would happen until he broke down one night again and told me he was paid a lot of money to do some bad things to bad people. He confessed that he was paid by someone in his dad's gang to burn someone's business down over a money dispute. Then he told me he killed a couple of guys who were thought to be touching children. He said he was given a handgun and a shotgun and was paid $10,000 after each man was executed. More than 10 years later, and I still don't know if I believe him or not. After he came back, he was so screwed up and depressed. If he was telling the truth, it would make sense. He kept doing drugs and drinking until about 5 years ago when he had a heart attack at age 27. He quit the substance abuse, but the damage was done. He suffered another heart attack 6 months later and died a few days after his 28th. He was the funniest and kindest person that I've ever known, and I miss him.